It's great to welcome to the program today Charles Wheelan, who is professor of public policy at Dartmouth, author of a number of books, many of which I've read, including Naked Economics, Naked Money, Naked Statistics. Great to have you on today.
Great. I'm glad you've read all the Naked books. That's how we
Yes.
refer to this series.
So in the books, you talk a lot, particularly in Naked Economics and Naked Money, about the impact and repercussions at a macroeconomic level of the government doing things, which include making adjustments to the money supply, making money available in different ways. So maybe to pick something that's going on now, when you look at the so-called coronavirus stimulus and how that was administered partially to individuals, partially as loans, partially to corporations. What about it from a broad economic standpoint was done correctly and what was not so good?
I think the best thing is that it put money in the pockets of people who needed it. Small businesses, and we'll get to how well it was targeted because that anticipates, I think, one of the weaknesses. And also consumers who are at risk of missing rent payments, being evicted, and the like. One of the most intriguing concepts in economics is the paradox of thrift. This idea that when something bad happens, our natural and entirely rational response is to spend less, to hang on to what we have. And of course, as soon as we hang on to what we have, then we don't buy a refrigerator, don't buy a car, don't go out to dinner. And that's the income of all of those folks. So they hang on more tightly. And of course, more businesses are in distress. So somehow government needs to overcome that paradox of thrift. Now, in the financial crisis, the problem was that all our financial institutions were paralyzed. Nobody could get credit. If you wanted to go to a restaurant, the restaurant was open. But how can we open the spigots of credit again so that the economy worked? With COVID, we've got an entirely different problem. The banking system is mercifully healthy, and many people went into COVID in pretty good financial shape, but they couldn't spend the money they had because the restaurant was closed. So the challenge there was to keep those restaurants afloat until we could get through, and I guess we're now seeing the end of the tunnel, the pandemic. Just keep them afloat as opposed to starting up, say, the financial system again.
Yeah, it seems when I look at the way some European countries and other countries handled this, they were more aggressive with the idea of we will pay the salaries of your employees so that you don't lay anybody off. I think the idea being that there would be less friction in getting things back up to speed because the employees would still be employees and so on. Do you think that was not done well enough in the U.S.?
I think our approach was probably a little more scattershot. Some of the payments to businesses had the effect of keeping employees on the books. On the other end, I talked to small business people who faced a dilemma whereby if they were kept on at reduced salary, their employees might have done better if they went on unemployment.
Right.
And so you created some kind of tension there. And then obviously what we've been reading in the news in the last couple of weeks about a high proportion of these payments going to a small number of firms. I haven't delved into that, but that does get to a question you always have to face, which is how well targeted is this to the folks who really need support in the near term? That's priority number one. Priority number two is how well targeted is it to the folks who will continue to spend in ways that keep other businesses healthy?
And what are the answers to those two questions as far as how it was done?
Somebody else. It strikes me as, given the time allotted, that it was probably about a B plus.
Okay.
I mean, we forget that nobody was, well, it's not true nobody was planning for this, but it certainly wasn't what we expected to come along. And when you've got to draw up something like this so quickly and deal with the politics, get it through a very divided Congress, I think we did actually reasonably well up to the present, where now again we're arguing over what the next phase of it ought to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we can talk about the lack of pandemic response readiness by the administration on the more medical side, getting rid of the pandemic response team, ignoring the playbook, et cetera. But the shock to the system from the economic side would have been a shock regardless, it sounds like, is what you're saying.
I think that's true. And I think there's some things that seem superficially attractive that have some downsides. So, for example, the moratorium on evictions and moratorium on things like that, it makes perfect sense. Like, you do not want to be throwing people out in the street in the middle of the pandemic. On the other hand, you do have to appreciate that those folks who are not paying rent are not paying rent to other small property owners who will then have trouble. So I'm much more comfortable with something that substitutes for those rent payments so that there's no eviction and therefore keeps the property owners whole, as opposed to just throwing the thrust of the pain on these small renters, many of whom may have just a couple of apartments that are a source of revenue. And if we say you can't evict them, but they're not paying you rent, then you've just created a different level of distress.
There is a perspective in economic thinking anytime you're talking about giving people money. This applies to stimulus. This applies to programs like universal basic income. This applies to minimum wage increases. And the very general idea is you devalue the currency. When you make it easier to get money, when you increase the supply of money, simple supply and demand suggests each dollar becomes worth less. There's inflation, and you end up basically in the exact same place. Can you talk now about the additional knowledge we have, including from behavioral economics and other types of economic thinking, that makes that less cut and dry?
Well, the one great puzzle of our time, pre-COVID, is why we're not seeing more inflation. We have pumped, going back to the financial crisis, up to and including the COVID response, we have pumped just staggering amounts of money and liquidity into the pipes. And we're barely reaching our inflation targets and sometimes failing to reach our inflation targets. So if you went back to grad school, when I was in grad school in the early 90s at the University of Chicago and said, hey, let me give you a hypothetical experiment where we pump trillions of dollars into the economy, do you think you're going to get price increases or maybe even a little deflation? Everybody would have said that is impossible. We're still trying to kind of work through that. Part of the behavioral economics explanation, and just let me say parenthetically, I think behavioral econ is one of the most interesting and exciting things to come along because it helps to answer some of these questions, is that when you become conditioned to stable prices for a long period of time, then it's harder to raise prices. It's the flip side of the 70s when everyone just assumed, hey, we're going to raise, I don't care what's going on in the macro. My prices are going up 15% this year just because that's what you do in spring. Maybe we're seeing the backside of that. There's some discussion about whether globalization has just continued to increase the global supply so much that we can absorb the money and spend it around the world. And the competition from China and Vietnam keeps prices low because American firms can't raise prices. It just keeps that constant pressure. My colleague here, Danny Blanchflower, has argued that a lot of the labor market data are very misleading. Unemployment looks really low, but when you delve into it, a lot of folks are not working as many hours as they would like to. They're feeling more tenuously attached to the labor market. And then he's found this interesting thing where if you ask people how likely they are to be fired or lose their job, they overstate it by like 5-fold. Because you can then follow them and find out how many of them are actually fired. What that means is that they are very reticent to ask for more money because they feel that their job is more precarious than it actually is. And that is another thing, keeping prices low. So it's probably some combination of these things. But I suspect that if you come up with some unifying theory of why all this money flowing into the system hasn't led to more inflation, you will certainly be on the Nobel shortlist.
Well, on the other side of this example that we're seeing I think in both naked economics and money, although you'll correct me, you often use my birth country of Argentina as an example of disasters when it comes to currency. I mean, we had the dollar peso peg, which completely failed. Hyperinflation, not at the level of like Zimbabwe or Venezuela, but still pretty bad. All these terrible situations when it comes to currency. What seems to be the tipping point where those cascading currency disasters happen in countries?
I think the difference between Argentina and most places in the world is that there's just not a lot of credibility. People don't believe the central bank. They don't believe the fiscal authorities. And a lot of monetary policy is about credible commitment, that you say you're going to do something, you do it. The markets respond in ways that if they believe you, reinforce what's going to happen. So when the chair of the Fed in the United States says, we're serious about inflation, we're not going to let prices rise faster than 2% ever, well, then people don't raise their prices because they assume that the Fed would fight that back. And it becomes a self-reinforcing prophecy. When the monetary authorities in Argentina say, hey, we're going to fight inflation, when everybody's done laughing, They say, yeah, we've seen this movie 11 times before. I mean, it's been a long time since I wrote Naked Money. We were going to put a whole chapter on Argentina in. Instead, we just used a lot of examples.
Yeah, that I'm glad you didn't do the whole chapter. That would have been more devastating. So when it comes to in Naked Money, when you talk about the credibility of money, as you're kind of talking about in the context of Argentina, you do address cryptocurrency, and you take head on some of the bullet points that we hear from some of the anti-cryptocurrency people, such as it doesn't have inherent value. And you explain that, the idea of gold having inherent value is also less clear, maybe, than some people point out. What's your sense now, since the book was written, about cryptocurrency? We've seen, early in the pandemic, people expecting Bitcoin to go crazy. We're disappointed that it didn't, but then in the last few months, we've actually seen significant increase in the value of Bitcoin. What's your sense of it now?
I'm still not very sold on the idea that Bitcoin is here for the long run for a number of reasons. I mean, part of you expect money to do a number of things, and I don't think Bitcoin does any of them very well. So one is as a unit of exchange, and this is the easiest one where it's clearly failed. I mean, part of the reason that we use dollars and not Argentine pesos is we have a pretty good idea of what the dollar is going to be worth next year, even 10 years. I mean, maybe plus or minus 2%, but it really doesn't move a whole lot.
Yeah.
When Bitcoin, right, when people say, wow, Bitcoin's on a roar, it's up 400%, that's not a good thing from the standpoint of money. Now, if you invested in it, you made a lot of money. But the point of money is I'm going to buy a house and I'm going to say, David, I'm going to give you 100 Bitcoins a year for the next 30 years. That's the way a mortgage works. Now, if those Bitcoins go up 400% in value, my mortgage payment just went up 4%. So it's very hard for us to contract using a monetary thing, that's fluctuating all the way, even if it's going up. You just want something stable. Now, the other things that we look for are, is it a good store of value? That one, I think, is also uncertain. Yes, it's gained value, but it's also plummeted at times.
Well, on that
also,
one, Charles, after how many years of at least it retaining some value, would we be able to say that the store of value requirement is met?
I don't know if it's a number of years. I think it's the percentage of people who are persuaded that it will hold its value. I mean,
Okay.
as you correctly pointed out, it's all whether I believe that it has value, and if I do, then I'll use it. So certainly more than it used to.
Yeah.
And then the last one is kind of as a unit of account, or not as a unit of account, but as a medium of exchange. So how easy is it to do transactions? And it's still much easier for me to use a credit card or use cash than it is for Bitcoin. I've got to go buy the Bitcoins. And so that
Well,
one's
I guess
probably
let
the
me
one.
push back slightly on that one. In the last year, I mean, now just like my credit card's linked up with my phone and I can swipe it, I can link Bitcoin with my phone with instant dollar conversions and swipe it the same way. So it's
Absolutely. I think
definitely
that
changed.
one, a lot of progress has been made. And
Yeah.
I would say, if you're in a place like Venezuela, or you're in a place where everything is just crumbling around you, then Bitcoin might serve some of these purposes better than for me sitting here in New Hampshire, right? You've got to park wealth someplace. You got to move it out of the country quickly. So it certainly has a purpose. Now, I'll add one other caveat that may be my biggest concern, which is at present, Bitcoin is a really handy medium of exchange for people doing really nefarious things. So we just had a huge hack of a hospital system in Vermont, one of these ransomware things where it's, pay us X millions of dollars or we'll destroy all your systems. And of course, the payment they want is in Bitcoin, which is terrific for them. I do have some concerns from the Bitcoin standpoint about if this becomes the medium of exchange for people doing bad things, then there might be some regulatory crackdown on it, in which case it becomes less attractive as a currency for everybody else.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, for me, the biggest concerns remain, in many cases, transaction fees and the unpredictable value. It's used for crime stuff. I mean, when Silk Road was shut down, which was believed to be a huge piece of the Bitcoin market, the Bitcoin market barely was affected in number of transactions or volume. It seemed to be a much smaller piece of it. And also, by the way, I mean, most crimes are being committed involving dollars. Most racketeering is happening in dollars. So that one is not super strong for me, but the logistics of it and the volatility seem to be my biggest concerns. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think bubbles are interesting. You never know for sure if you're in a bubble until it's over. So in 2005, I thought that property prices were frothy,
Yeah.
but I didn't short the property market. It would have been kind of hard to do. I also thought that Amazon was wildly overpriced. I was right on one of those things and terribly wrong on the other. So, I think time will tell. But I love the discussion because I think Bitcoin forces us to think about what money is. Why
Yeah.
are the pieces of paper issued by the Argentine government different than the pieces of paper issued by the American government? Because it's all just paper.
Thinking about the next 5 years, 10 years, what types of systemic changes do you anticipate to economic and financial systems that are a result of either technological change or cultural change, like the big picture things?
I think the biggest question is what the next phase of capitalism looks like. We're not going to go socialist. I'm old enough to have lived through the Soviet Union. I traveled there. I've been to Cuba. That's not the future. On the other hand, I think I teach a lot of young people who look around and say, well, something's not quite right. I mean,
Right.
why is the richest country in the history of civilization? Why are people living on the street? Clearly, what the populists of both the left and the right, both Trump and Bernie, who, when you parse it, are saying some of the same things.
Different
about
policy,
trade.
but similar rhetoric. Yeah.
Right. So exactly, not the diagnosis is broadly similar. They are reflecting the fact that despite great wealth and over my lifetime, enormous growth in the economy and incomes, people feel very insecure and they feel not fully happy with the level of disruption. And of course, we're looking at AI and other things coming down the pike. So I think the question for people who are center right and center left, so not the socialists, not the nationalist populists, is how do we tighten the safety net so that the folks who we know are being disrupted or will be disrupted can kind of bounce back into this vibrant, growing economy without just hitting the ground. And interestingly, I think, center left has always talked about this. When you look at the Scandinavian countries, they're actually robust capitalist economies.
Yes.
They just have a tighter safety net.
Right.
But I think it's going to become more interesting for center right. There are folks like Orrin Cass, who's a conservative thinker, who's talking more about the role that unions might play from a conservative standpoint to give workers more voice. I think there's going to be a lot of fresh thinking about how we harness everything that is great about capitalism. And there's a lot there, while we sew the holes up that are clearly the failures and deficiencies.
Orrin Cass. I'll have to do a little reading up. Hey, before I let you go, I recently read the book Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, which is pandemic literature.
And also it's beautiful writing.
Absolutely
Beautiful
fantastic
writing.
book. Fantastic book. You've written The Rationing, also about a global pandemic. This is like a genre now, pandemic literature.
It is. Lawrence Wright, who's another terrific writer, wrote a book, I think the end of October, which is about a pandemic. So yes, my book, The Rationing, is about who gets the vaccine
Right.
during a pandemic. And just to point out, it was written in 2019.
Yes.
So yes, it is part of the reason it's a genre is the same reason that apocalypse movies are a genre, is we're fascinated by how we behave as humans in adverse circumstances. That's why we watch war movies over and over again. So it wasn't that I was a genius about the pandemic. That was just a convenient tool for looking at the political response. It's really a political thriller.
That's The Rationing. We've been speaking with Charles Wheelan, professor of public policy at Dartmouth. Also check out the Naked books, Naked Economics, Naked Money, Naked Statistics. I so appreciate your time today.
Oh, it was great to talk to you.